This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 478, entitled The Masculists' Strongest Arguments Against MGTOW Political Passivity. Description. This flyer spells out the main arguments the Masculists use to critique the political passivity of the MGTOWs. The main one is the hugely greater level of anger and hatred that Masculists have against their enemies than do the MGTOWs. That is, against the fluffy parasites, the fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders, the monoconscious feminazi gender politicians, etc. When there are large numbers of angry, hateful Masculists on campus, they will turn back the gender political bias that favours women, thus thrilling the journalists to report on Masculist MGTOW ideas so that the public learns of them, so that, in time, the gender laws are men-fared. Today's MGTOW-dominated male gender politics is the historical equivalent of the feminist consciousness-raising group phase of the late 60s, who later moved on to change the gender laws in favour of women. Masculists are out to do the same, using a tactic of anger and hatred at the decades-lasting manslavery by women of men, at the financial massacring of one father in 4 in the hated fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, at the hypocritical opposition of women against the legislation of the that's paternity, rejection right, when women have the marrow, etc. A masculist tsunami is coming against women that they will be powerless to stop, as masculists explode in anger and hatred against them for their decades-lasting gender oppressions of men. Now the flyer itself. The Masculists' Strongest Arguments Against MGTOW Political Passivity by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. After my recent discovery of the MGTOW video hosting site MGTOW.tv, I've been busy uploading about 800 of my Masculist MGTOW videos to it. Brackets actually a bit under 500, but they often have parts in separate videos. And amuse myself watching my channel's icon rise in the rankings of that site in terms of the number of hits my channel has had. At the time of writing, I've only uploaded 1/10 of them, and my ranking is already in the upper half. I'm wondering if I'll end up in the top 10? Ego tripping aside, the Masculist MGTOW videos of mine that are already up are causing some fundamental fault lines to manifest themselves in the comments to my videos, between the differing gender political strategies towards men's lib, between the MGTOWs and the Masculists. The more reflective, thinking MGTOWs take the view that the Masculist approach is a waste of time, that it has been tried by the MRM, men's rights movement, for decades and has got nowhere. So to continue to flog a dead horse by insisting on MRM tactics is tantamount to insanity. So, the MGTOWs argue, the more intelligent, more productive alternative to the legislative fight for equal legal rights for men by the MRM is to walk away from a system that is sick, profoundly sexist, misandrist and vile. The MGTOW approach to reject marriage, reject paternity and to spend one's money on oneself as a man makes sense if you are convinced that the MRM approach is useless, that it has been time-tested for decades and has obviously failed. Personally, I don't deny that the MRM in the US has largely failed. I even made a Masculist flyer, number 229, entitled, quote, "Why is the US men's rights movement, in brackets MRM, so impotent?" Question mark, close brackets. Stating that the MRM was not angry enough, lacked publicity imagination, were not hateful enough against its enemies, etc. I suggest reading/watching that flyer before this one to create some context. It's true that the Masculist and the MRM do overlap in a lot of their goals, that is, in changing the gender laws, which is probably why I'm now getting a lot of flack from the more thoughtful MGTOWs who see this similarity and jump to conclusions that the Masculists are just another version, a minor variant of the MRM. One of the aims of this flyer is to show that such MGTOWs, that is not true. But its main aim is to persuade MGTOWs why it is necessary to change society, to change the gender political zeitgeist and the gender laws, so that society and the law is much fairer to men. To make a historical analogy, look at the relatively recent development of feminism. After Betty Friedan came out with her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, which launched the second wave feminist movement, in which she complained about how bored upper middle class American housewives of the 60s were with the traditional housewife role and yearned to become careerists like their husbands, to be challenged and tested in the competitive real economic world, now that they had the pill, household gadgets, higher education, all provided by men, and with their 0, 1 or 2 kids had time in their hands once their youngest child was off to kindergarten. I've spoken with Betty Friedan for about 10 minutes at the Copenhagen United Nations Mid-Decade for Women conference. Friedan was a genius with a whopping IQ of 180, as she stated in one of her books that I have. She could see clearly that feminism was only half the story, and that the second half of the story, that is masculism, had, in brackets, then in 1980, close brackets, yet to be written. She and I both agreed that female careerism would allow men to be freed from the traditional male role of being a manslave to a woman, working for decades for a woman. That masculism would be essentially abolitionism, a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, forcing women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up. In brackets, FIP, that's F-I-P, equals financially independent person, to use modern masculist vernacular. Friedan and others like her soon realised, after the feminist consciousness-raising sessions in the universities and major cities like New York, Boston, etc., that the next major phase of feminism, once there were millions of voting feminists, that the time was then ripe, in the 70s and 80s, to put powerful voting pressure on the gender politicians to give women the political rights that they wanted. For example, equal pay for equal work, the right for women to enter the professions, the right to an abortion, to be given fault-free divorce, to take control of the divorce courts, converting them into family courts, which became much more favourable to women's desires and a lot less to men's desires. Legislating the MARA, maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, etc. In other words, these feminist leaders saw very clearly and very early on that their movement consisted of 2 major pillars, that is, feminist consciousness raising, that is, educating women about the disadvantages of the traditional housewife role, being financially dependent on a man, her husband, and later, the second major pillar, the political push for fundamental changes in the gender laws for women, putting women in the parliaments, in the boardrooms, in presidencies and prime ministerships, etc. These conscious raised feminists then achieved nearly all the basic political goals that they wanted in the 70s and 80s. Women got equal pay for equal work, the abortion right, the right to enter the professions, fault-free divorce, takeover of the divorce courts, etc. Feminists today are still pretty much in this political phase, aiming to give women real political power by pushing for not just equal rights with men, but equal outcomes with men, that is, imposing female quotas so that women occupy half of the seats in parliaments, half of the boardroom directorships, etc. Third wave feminism is essentially about power, achieving equal power with men. Masculism has learned a lot from feminism. It uses concepts basic to feminism. For example, masculist consciousness raising, equal rights for men. For example, the push for the men fairing of the gender laws in the divorce courts, the legislation of the that's paternity rejection right, the creation of gender equality committees in the parliaments, consisting half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender political issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today. Most people, when hearing the term gender politics, think automatically, unconsciously of feminism, women's rights, women's lib. So, to pursue the historical analogy from my 60-odd years in gender politics, men today are still in the male consciousness phase, analogous to where women were in the late 1960s, when women were huddling together in women's consciousness-raising circles, talking about the disadvantages of the traditional housewife role and dreaming up superior alternatives. I see MGTOW as the historical equivalent of those feminist consciousness-raising days. The feminists have long since moved on, having achieved most of their basic political goals, and are now in third wave feminism, out to achieve real political power for women. As a masculist who was already a young adult in the early 70s, I have seen feminism rise and rise, changing society profoundly, as women in their billions shifted away from being housewives, financially dependent on their husbands, to being careerists in their own right, being FIPs, that's financially independent persons, thus not manslaving a man. But to MGTOWs, most of whom are half my age, have grown up with feminism, which is part of the furniture for them, unconscious, unquestioned, in the air. So it's harder for MGTOWs to see what the feminists did, whereas for older masculists like me, it's not a great leap of imagination to envisage the masculists doing the same for men. Such masculists saw women move from housewifery to careerism, so masculists can imagine men moving from manslavery to free men with equal rights. The masculists see themselves as a major gender political step ahead of the MGTOWs, who are seen by the masculists as still in the consciousness-raising stage for men, talking about how women, that is fluffy feminists, in brackets, fluffy equals a masculist term for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, close brackets. Financially massacre divorcing fathers in the divorce courts. How women pill lie to their boyfriends/husbands, get pregnant, then by law force a man to pay for a kid he doesn't want for decades, thus manslaving him for decades, a major gender crime committed by the woman against the man. Yet men have no that is paternity rejection right. In the early 2020s, we men are still in the male consciousness raising phase, but that is only half the story. As Marx famously said, quote, "The philosophers have merely interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it," end quote. As a masculist, I can only cheer at this. As a masculist, a biconscious masculist, quote, who is familiar with feminist ideas as masculist ideas, end quote, it's clear as day to me that the men's movement has really only begun. We men have a society to change, to fundamentally change, by educating both sexes that now that women have a half-century career window, they have a powerful moral duty to fip up or be severely punished by men by not getting one. We Masculists and MGTOWs have a hefty education job ahead of us. We need to educate the masses about the horrific injustices committed against men by the law and by women, especially in the divorce courts. No no gender justice in the parliaments, in brackets, that is, no Masculists in the gender equality committees in the parliaments, etc. It's clear to the Masculists that the first stage of the Masculist agenda is education, getting the Masculist MGTOW word out to men, pushing for the establishment of Masculist groups in every high school, every campus, so that young men are in a position and with a sufficient state of knowledge and conviction to put enormous moral pressure on young fluffies to fip up or face total rejection by men for being hated, fluffy, manslaving parasites who expect to be able to live off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades of his life. One of the major aims of the Masculists, in comparison with the political passivity of the wimpy MGTOWs, is to get men angry, to get them feeling real hate against their enemies, that is the fluffies, the fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders, and the gender politicians who created the deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place. To Masculists, what women do to men in the divorce courts, women's decades-lasting manslavery of men, no gender justice in the parliaments, etc., is a war issue, a casus belli. Wars are often driven by hatred. Look at the US Civil War, which was largely over the issue of the hated immorality of Negro slavery. To Masculists, manslavery is a hugely larger problem, since there are billions of manslaves in the world who need knowledge of masculism to liberate themselves, hence the enormous political drive of the Masculists. The MGTOWs don't think like this. They just passively